Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. And I know that you're expecting coverage of the events in Ukraine, the Israel Palestine conflict, some news out of Europe, and of course, Biden's State of the Union address. We will get to all of that. But first, I have groundbreaking major news that we need to get out of the way. Haiti is on the verge of collapse, okay? There's been a prison breakout, and there's riots in the street. Haiti, the previous paragon of stability in this hemisphere, it's not doing well. It's not doing well, and I hate to report
Mhm.
that because Haiti was such an example. As we were all told, it was indeed. Look, Trump's words, Trump's very harsh words about that, I were assured were false, and that Haiti is a very nice, developed country that, frankly, we can all look up to. So it's very tragic to see this happen in such a prosperous and stable nation that there's been a massive prison breakout. But now we can get on to the minor stories of the show. Now we've gotten
Yeah.
that major breaking news out of the way. So I suppose you have some news on Ukraine that will
Yes.
just pale in
So
comparison to what we discovered.
definitely. So I sent you the map. So this is a better image than what I posted the last two times. All those yellow squiggly lines are the defenses that Ukraine has built over the years. I think most of them are actually before the SMO. Notice that south of Donetsk, the red line that goes down south, you can see that there's all kinds of yellow fortifications. All those were built actually before the SMO because that solid red line is not part of Russian fortifications. That is the area that was under the separatist control. Anyways, so I guess I can start with things that happened in the earlier part of the week and in the south on the Black Sea first, and that is another Russian ship was sunk, the Kotov. This was another, I guess, missile ship, but not maybe as substantial as the Ivanovets. So it's not the landing ship that was destroyed that preceded it. So that's three ships now since January the 1st. Um, and this comes after the admiral in charge of the Black Sea Fleet was fired in February, and that was over the landing ship. That was one ship too many. But I have some interesting um, I maps and ideas. Dima from Military Summary had made some very interesting points about what could possibly happen next, right? So the Russians have had a lot of success, basically taking out air defense systems since, let's say, February 20th. They've knocked out Bukes. They knocked out two Patriots today. So about five Patriots altogether, three S-300s, a Buk, et cetera, et cetera. And that's allowed them to bomb even further closer to the front line. And the reason why Ukrainians are losing their air defense systems is, well, Avdiivka is a prime example, and that is because the Russians used aviation far more in Avdiivka than they did in Bakhmut, um, and that has forced the Ukrainians to get closer to the front line in order to shoot down the Russian jets. Now, of course, you hear lots of stories about the Russian jets getting blown out of the sky. I'm not saying that never happens, but Ukraine has claimed like over 15. And then the Americans yesterday actually put out a notice from the Pentagon saying that they do not believe Ukraine's claims that they have shut down 15 Russian fighters like in the last 2 weeks or something. But one of the things that the Ukrainians are probably eager to do is to make another go for Crimea. And I know that sounds crazy, but I think what they're hoping for, there's several things why this is the case. One is the increased talks by the Russians that they're going to go for Odessa. The other is the attack on Odessa by the Russians when Mitsotakis, the Greek, is he president or prime minister?
Prime Minister, the
Uh,
one who just recently indulged in the
yes.
same-sex marriage nonsense, but I digress.
Yeah. Yeah. What a hero. Um, so, anyways, so what they're looking to do, I'll just put up this image, this just so people can sort of focus on Odessa, maybe what was taken out there. As you can see, there was a radar installation system that was destroyed on the same day that Mitsotakis was there. Now, Baerbock was there the day before, and a missile hit Odessa as well while she was there. Now, Zelensky was never in danger of being killed, nor Mitsotakis, nor Baerbock. Um, they were quite far from that area. 5 Ukrainians were killed in the attack on the radar station and on various other installations and say military concentration. I don't know if the 5 are civilians or not. All I've heard is that there are indeed casualties. Now, if you look at the map and you look at the Russian controlled area way up near the top, uh, that spit that juts out directly across Odessa. That is the area where some people have speculated, including Dima, that the Ukrainians would like to take that area and open the port of Nikolaev. Now, I don't know if this is like one of Dima's, theories. He can be initially very persuasive. He thinks like the amount of human loss in order to secure this area, uh, the Ukrainians would tolerate. And he himself built this theory based on a Ukrainian um, military guy, young guy, 30s, let's say, who's fighting and who was speculating about to distract the Russians from their offensive in the east, which is going fairly well. They need to distract them, and if we can hold this spit, I just don't see it. I don't see how. Like theoretically, I understand it, but it's not possible, not now. So, anyways, I already regret bringing it up. Now, the other thing that has been happening in this region is there was a concentration of Ukrainians that got hit here, but we're not talking about massive numbers. They were in a forest area. This is in the Kherson area, basically south of Nikolaev. Trying to find, yes. So here's that map. This is also incidentally where the Ukrainians lost 2 HIMARS this week. They lost a total of 3. And that doesn't include the one I mentioned several shows back. But this week they've lost apparently 3 HIMARS. I will say that one of the 3, which was destroyed like on the border of Donetsk and Lugansk, that appears like maybe at a different time of the year. The colors look off. It's one of those video footages that are very, very yellow. But in any case, at least 2 HIMARS systems were destroyed in this area. This is also an area where back in February, the Ukrainians also lost a Patriot system. I believe on the 25th. And they also lost a NASAMS here yesterday. So a lot of stuff going on in this area. And they also lost another NASAMS system, I would say around the 26th of February. So the Russians are very much going for an aerial strategy where their Air Force can perform almost completely unencumbered. So, from February 20th to March 9th, they've lost 9 to 10 air defense systems, including a Buk, which is more short range. Um, let's see what's going on. The further east we go, and I'm going to send you a map of Rabotina, where there has been a lot of fighting. You can see that the Russians have now completely taken the Surovikin lines that the Ukrainians had taken. The Russians have lost Rabotino. They had a part of it, and the Ukrainians control the 1/3. The rest is in the gray zone, but the Russians have lost the defense system beneath the town itself. This was, well, it's not even a town; it's a village. I think it had 470 people at its height before the outbreak of the SMO. Not much happening in the Vermevsky Ledge, as they call it. Same thing in Ugledar. A lot of bombing, a lot of fabs. All of that, which really started to amp up in February, in the onslaught on Avdiivka, has continued. And of course, the more the Russians push westward from Avdiivka, the more that these counter battery radar systems, artillery itself, the Ukrainians lost 5 artillery pieces in the area west of Avdiivka. So they're throwing everything they have in order to stop the Russians. The Russians have actually complained that they have been outnumbered 2-1 in the villages directly outside of Avdiivka. Now, the first line they have captured, but the villages of like Tonenka they recaptured today, but Orlovka is mostly under their control, and Berdichi is, well, they only control about, I would say, 25% of it, maybe 30% of it. A good chunk of that is in the gray zone, and part of it is, the other part is firmly controlled by the Ukrainians. I'm honestly trying to get you a map of that. Yeah, this is it. So this is Syriac map, and this shows that the Russians have, well, okay, so they did take Orlovka. Anyways, so the Ukrainian Syrskyi has managed to send a good deal of troops here. Now, remember, I said on the last show that in Berdichi there was a lot of heavy fighting, and there was. I told you about the BTR that went in with like 10 guys on board, and just the Ukrainians basically ambushed them. Now, Berdichi is an area that's obviously very important to the Ukrainians because it's the furthest north on the front line and it's the closest to Ukrainian logistics. It's the easiest one also to defend. But the Russians went in, and it seems almost like they were under the impression that there was nobody left in the village. However, this BTR goes in. There's about 8 or 9 guys on top. They jump off. History legend says he visually saw 5 or 6 of them get killed. The other ones, who knows? I'm going to presume they're dead. And the BTR then sped off. It was hit. It was intercepted, but the crew got away. The next day, what do you think the Russians did? They sent in another BTR, this time without 9 guys on top, but it's destroyed. Kind of like, honestly, just crazy. Then, the fighting for Orlovka, which is the southernmost town on that new front line that the Russians have created west of Avdiivka. They had an armor assault. It was semi-successful. But they did have a BMP that had like 9 guys in it. It's hit by a drone. Now, it's not going to kill all those guys, but 1 or 2 of them probably. And it disabled the vehicle. Nonetheless, I mean, the fighting is extremely brutal. Anybody who follows this war really closely on Telegram knows um, just how merciless both sides can be. There's been a recent spat of videos of Ukrainians killing Russian POWs and Russian soldiers killing Ukrainian POWs. Um, there's just a kind of unbelievable intensity. But however, there was a very interesting story that came out of Avdiivka today, and it is about a conscript named Alex for the Ukrainian forces from Nikolaev. So the Russians are storming Avdiivka. They go into a building. It's badly shelled. One of the Russian commanders, or not commander, soldier, Sergei, is wounded. One leg is twice fractured. He's got shrapnel in his eye. I saw the interview of him bandaged up. Honestly, it looks like it did affect the eye quite a bit. It's working, but like it seems lower on the face. It's just horrendous. So he's wounded. He can't see anything. He's been bandaged up. He doesn't have his gun or anything. And the Ukrainian soldier comes in purportedly to clear this place. This would have been probably when the Ukrainians were tasked with like creating a way out of the city. So this guy's not Azov. He's a recruit. He says he had only had a few weeks of training before he was thrown into Avdiivka. And what happens is the Russian, who's all bandaged up and wounded, with the broken leg and the shrapnel in his eye, and I believe he had a wound in one of his arms. He says, "Don't shoot. I, you know, I don't have a gun. I don't have a vest. I surrender." The Ukrainian then tells him he surrenders. And so he basically kept this guy alive for 3 days before they were both evacuated by the Russians. And he got water for him from a puddle. So he risked his life, going just so you do hear these like absolutely like crazy stories. And I've seen one where a guy who was wounded in the coke plant area, the Russians basically dragged him over the rubble and began treating him. Some other really crazy, interesting developments is the front lines happening in Novomikhailivka. This is a city that is southwest of Donetsk cities, which is also southwest of Avdiivka. I'm going to try to find the... Nope, that's not it. Sorry. Well, here's a close-up of it. So Russians have the last time we did the show, the Russians planted a flag in the center of the city. It's not really a city; it's a town. It's not a village, but it's not a city either. So one of the craziest things that they did in this area is the Russians began deploying. I'm sending it to you now. They began deploying these armored personnel carriers with these boxes and openings on the sides, and I'll send you a close up of this. This was like really crazy. And you can see them, and that's basically to protect the soldiers from FPV drones. Some of these infantry fighting vehicles didn't even bother turning around. That they began to use these as like shelters. I thought I saw in the video one of these things like on the back come off. So the diagram that I sent you earlier with the yellow and the red, that is this attack. That is what it was done with. And the other thing that the Russians have begun doing is, for instance, That is, if they are if their vehicle is hit, then they just immediately begin digging underneath it in order to entrench themselves. So you can see the kind of the brutality of the fighting that is going on. I'm just looking up. Sorry, I just want to find a better image for you guys of Nova Mikhailovka, just so you get a better idea of where it's situated. I thought I had it in my files, but it's not there. Let me check. Sorry. Hmm. The thing is I often have so many of these images. I have to like they just take up space, and I have to get rid of them. In any case, I'll leave it at that. So um, I'm sorry. So that is the situation in Nova Mikhailovka. Now I'll send you an image to you from another town southwest of Donetsk called Krasnogorovka. The Russians have made considerable headway in this region. This is a much better fortified town than Nova Mikhailovka. Um, they are much further in now than what you see there on the map. That image is from February 25th. You can see the gains that they have made there. Um, yes. So now, since then, they've gone further. Here's another image. Which you can see the yellow outlines are the fortifications. So the Russians are basically attacking from the south. This is from March the 3rd, so it's about a week ago. So they've gone a little bit further now. You see in the image what's in the gray zone where the red and white pistol icon is. That's where the Russians are now. And they have moved the other red bar, like the border up to the beginning of that diagonal line. Um, so we'll see how well they do there, and maybe an image now of like so basically people understand what the situation, because I think this is sort of like for the Russians right now, this is going to be the most important situation in the Donetsk area. The green basically shows the area that the Russians firmly control. They have a little bit more control than that now, but not a lot more than that. And you see where the fortifications are for the Ukrainians. And you see in the green the yellow fortifications that the Russians basically had to conquer in order to get into Avdiivka. But all that space between Avdiivka, the front line of Avdiivka to the first line of defense, number one, you can see there's not much there at all. And everything along number one is also on a height, and number two, it's on a greater height. So the Ukrainians here have a better chance of containing the Russians, depending on how things go with, let's say, Russia's Air Force. Yes. Okay. Now there've been the other sort of story that's happening in the Bakhmut areas is that the Russians have taken over 50% of Ivanivskaya, or I think the Russians call it Krasnaye, and that is the first village outside of Bakhmut before you get to Chasov Yar. And here's an example of that. So now this image is from March the 2nd, so it's a week old. The Russians do control more of this territory than what you see here, so it's a week old. In any case, the thing about Ivanivske, where the pistol icon is, and if you go northwest from there, that's Chasov Yar. The thing is both these areas are higher than everything on the east side, which is Bakhmut, and everything on the west side, which is like Konstantinovka, yet another city named Konstantinovka. And so capturing this area will be extremely important for the Russians. And I'd have to say that Ivanivske is nearly done. Now, there is speculation because the Ukrainians now have started fortifying many areas of Ukraine all along the Belarusian border, all along the North Ukrainian border with Russia proper. I think a lot of people are expecting the Russians in the summer to make an offensive, you know. And if they do, you know, where are they going to go? Well, you know, one idea is that they're going to surround Kiev again. Another is that they're going to surround Kharkov because a town south of Kharkov, Poltava, is a major logistical hub. So is Dnieper. What feeds the Donetsk area are these main axes. Odessa is a city that I think would be nice to have, but it's not. It's at the beginning of the chain supply for Ukraine, and it's not even the major one. The major one, of course, is a border with Poland, like Lvov. So I would say
there's so many issues with Odessa, and with the amount of NATO focus on it. You'll actually recall, I believe it was after the Ukrainian counteroffensives, after the Russians done their mobilization. We're probably talking about September or October 2022,
yeah,
where the U.S. had military drills in Romania and I also
yeah,
believe Bulgaria. When the
yeah,
Russians were actually heading towards Nikolaev, there was all the speculation about the dirty bomb. So, unless there is a major
yes,
falter by NATO, Odessa is simply off the table at this point.
right. But also logistically, say there's no chance of NATO intervening or even Macron intervening. It's just logistically, it would be very hard to do it. If you're going to go by sea, obviously you can sink the ships. That's not a problem. There's still lots of mines around Odessa, right? The logistics to get everything there would be a very, very colossal effort without like taking Nikolaev first. Um, you know, uh, in 2022, of course, the Russians just hit Nikolaev repeatedly. Remember, they destroyed all this infrastructure that the British built there. But I would say that Odessa is not possible without taking care of other areas first. And personally, what I believe, the Russians basically want a total victory in Donetsk. I think they want that. Because after this defensive belt of, let's say, Avdiivka, Konstantinovka, uh, to a lesser extent, Ivanivskaya, Chasov Yar, all these places are really important for them. Krasnogorovka, that's another one. Novomihailovka. Novomihailovka will probably fall, but I think what they want is this first, and they can't make any attempt for Odessa unless that's the case. And realistically, even if they went to Odessa, right, all the logistics that supply Donetsk vis-a-vis Poland, Kiev, Kharkov, Poltava, the Lugansk region, and then into Donetsk, that would still exist. you would still have to have like this part-time job of trying to get rid of this logistics hub while you go after Odessa. And how do you keep it? You're prone from attacks from the north. Landing troops there would be very difficult. It would just be a huge undertaking. And as I said, it doesn't even need to have NATO there. Like it's already it would be already a major undertaking at where this war is in 6 months' time. If the war is very different, yeah, this is a possibility. I think Russia would be willing to call America's bluff. I think they are.
Especially at this point, I would agree. And I mean, we can get into the myriad of issues with America, both domestic and abroad, that would suggest that the Russians are willing to take that risk. But I'll save that for later in the show.
Yeah, if they're going to go to Odessa, it's going to be by land. Like it's not going to be some spectacular naval landing ship. I mean,
No, what's the point?
stuff like that they did in World War II is literally you need millions of men, not 650,000 men. Like you need millions of men to do this. It's not it's not going to be a D-Day thing. This war has many aspects that are familiar that we are familiar from, looking at historical footage from World War I and World War II, but it's just not on that scale. It's a big scale. It's the biggest one Europe has seen since World War II, but it's not remotely on that scale.
No, and I mean the idea of a naval invasion of Odessa has it's been floated since the beginning of the war. It's been something that's been speculated about since the beginning of the war. And as you were saying, the logistics it would take to pull it off are enough to just disqualify it out of hand. The other thing is, and we saw this the naval action in the Black Sea over this past week, but even if we were to get an uptake in Russian naval action, even if we were to get a more quote unquote secure position in the Black Sea, not to suggest the Russians are taking heavy naval losses, but once again, we've seen what the British cooperation with the Ukrainians has delivered. It has been a constant harassment campaign of the Russian Navy, far beyond the capabilities of what Ukraine could conduct on its own. This is clearly being conducted by a foreign power. Once again, I would say I think the British are in charge of naval warfare operations in this war, which is a sideshow as it is anyway. But to increase to the level of being able to pull off a naval invasion of Odessa, it, I don't want to say they would be sitting ducks for the British or the British coordinated efforts the Ukrainians would pull off, but it would be a massive headache that could very easily be avoided. There's no reason to go ahead and do this, and that's even getting into the question of is Odessa a target anyway? And I concur for a number of reasons. At this point, no, it is not a target. Who knows what this war will deliver in the future? But I do think that what we are most likely, I have to agree with you again, looking at is another attempt at Kharkov and pushing in that direction, as you were talking about with supply hubs, with Poltava. It's really the most
It's the
logical.
one that makes most
Yes,
sense.
and
Like,
it also, and look, I know Belarus has been a largely independent actor in this war, but with their war footing, with the saber rattling they've been doing, if anything were to happen out of Belarus, it does make sense that they are heading in that direction, just given the geography.
yeah, yeah, it makes no sense. And if you look at what the Ukrainians are doing, I'll send you an image right now. Um, they're building their own defensive lines in the north because that's what they're afraid of happening, right? So yeah,
Which I do have to say, I struggle to really flag down what the future of this war looks like, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. And I do have some outside events related to Ukraine, of course, that I do want to discuss, getting into Zelensky's visit to Turkey, the statements by the Pope and by Western leaders, and the fallout from that, and of course, Newland's departure from the State Department as well. That's also another major story that we need to
Hmm.
get into regarding this. But before we get into Newland, I'll just go over some of those other ones briefly. So for starters, the Pope has now been put on the uh, what is it, the Mirotovitz list or Mirovets, whichever one it is. But the the
Are you kidding me?
the
Really?
the yeah, the SBU hit list. That was not a fake up, and that is because of he was hosting one of these events that,
Ukraine is literally like a terrorist state. Anybody who disagrees with Ukraine
yeah,
has to die. Reminds me of Israel.
yeah, and I'm actually going to get into. Do you know what his grave offense was? He said there is
What?
no shame in negotiation,
Yes.
referencing the Ukrainians, saying that I think he said the honor of the white flag or something, that pretty much saying that no, this is not a viable war effort. Which it's interesting because I followed the statements of various Western leaders, and look, beyond his role as a cleric, beyond his role as the head of the Catholic Church, in many ways, I don't think it's controversial to say that Francis, or regardless of who is holds the office of the papacy, is a political figure. That's not controversial to say at all. And I've followed his statements. I've followed many other Western leaders because although the Catholic Church is a fraction of the political power that it said maybe even just 50 years ago, for if we're being honest, it
Yeah.
still does have some weight to throw around. And you'll notice the beginning of the war was very much in line with the whole Ukraine thing. Then it shifted, saying that, oh, maybe NATO bears some responsibility. I believe we talked about that around spring 2022. And it's gone back and forth where he has been critical of the Russians, however conciliatory towards them at the same time. And to his credit, I will admit he has been one of the more level-headed public figures in the West to speak about the war in Ukraine, which is strange because I know how controversial he can be just on a number of different issues. But his most recent statement is really in line with what I think anyone who has a sane reading on the situation would say. But it's gotten so desperate that yes, the SPU has put him on the hit list. And
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I did forget to mention. I'll send you a very interesting little image. One of the techniques that the Russians are doing, we talked about this on the show about Ukraine's active defense, right? Where they have basically conscripts defending an area. And then if they get overrun, then the elite forces go in that are much better trained, better equipped. So one of the things that the Russians have been doing, both in Robotino and Verbove, uh, in that salient, what's actually allowed them to gain that territory, especially around Verbove, is they send this image I sent you basically has three guys that go on a. I saw the whole video. There's two of them actually. They go on a quad bike. Those four-wheel off-road bikes, and so three guys are on these things, and they just go and attack, the front lines, and then they pull away. So what they're trying to do is the exhaust the Ukrainian active defense. This is sort of one area where this technique seems to be paying off. Um, so, anyways, I just thought I'd mention that.
certainly, and yeah, it's definitely shifting the nature of this war and how it's being conducted. And like I said, there's still so much up in the air. I don't think the situation has been this uncertain since the actual outbreak of the war. And I don't say that lightly because there has been some very muddled events in this war. But moving on to return to Macron's statement,
Yeah.
where he, of course, talked about the potential of what would effectively be a NATO expeditionary force functioning under their own banners. Therefore, it wouldn't be a NATO intervention, so it wouldn't trigger Article 5 and bring the entire alliance in the war, while still being able to have NATO boots on the ground supporting Ukraine. Everyone has come out and completely condemned it. And we were discussing this off air. It was the kind of statement you would expect to be made by a country like Latvia. One of these
Hmm.
barking chihuahuas that has really no stake in this war, whose contributions, even if they were to give half their GDP, would still be a fraction of what some of these Western countries who have been rather lackadaisical have provided to Ukraine. But
Hmm.
this is coming from one of the few powers in NATO that actually has the capability to do something. Once again, I talk about the handful of NATO countries that are actually capable of putting up a standing army that would be capable of functioning in a real war. And France, yes, love them, hate them, despite its problems, is one of those countries. And
Yeah.
he's gotten no support. I mean, as we were talking, Poland has even come out and condemned him. Now, I know that Tusk is not a right wing figure by any means, and his position towards this war has been once again of two minds. Where he, of course, is all in on the Ukraine bandwagon, he'll throw in support for that, but after a certain point, he'll have to concede on certain issues. For example, the grain issue is still going on. They're still harping on about that, and that's still an outstanding issue. Where a lot of these countries that you would think be Ukraine's strongest supporters, and in many ways are, especially when you look at how much they have contributed, are growing weary of supporting Ukraine. And the grain deals is one of those issues, not to mention the drain on their state budget and, of course, the number of refugees, where these countries are becoming exhausted by this war effort, the countries that are bearing the brunt of the primary response to it, with the supplies that, as you were saying, flow through Poland into Western Ukraine, with the amount of refugees that they do have to manage and they do have to sift through, it it's become untenable for many of these nations. And the principal powers of the West, particularly the U.S., I would say to a lesser extent the UK, France, are determined to squeeze every ounce of juice they can out of this and trying to just really push these countries to the brink, completely disarm them. Another story that shows how up to date Western stockpiles are and how strong the support is for the war in Ukraine is France, I believe, along with it was Germany, Italy, and possibly the UK. Don't quote me on that last part. Were soliciting nations like Qatar and other nations that they've sold weapons to try to buy those back to give those to Ukraine. And it
Hmm.
was Qatar. It was I think actually Algeria, which is on a country on quite good terms with Russia at the moment. Now the thing is about countries like Algeria, where they have a very strong business relationship with Russia, but of course, if the West can throw a little bit their way, they're not going to be a steadfast allies the same way some other countries might be. But that's not to say that, of course, they're in the pocket of the West. Once again, there's a lot of countries that are playing both sides with this. A lot of countries that would have condemned Russia a long time ago had they seen an avenue for personal gain. However, the West just has nothing to offer at this point. I do think, to a much lesser extent, India would fall under that category, even though India and Russia do historically have pretty good relations, especially going back in the Soviet era. But that's aside the point. But you are seeing this listing of the quote unquote neutral nations by the West, particularly for their arms stockpiles. And one of the more clownish stories that had happened was that Ukrainian special forces were deployed for an advisory role in the Sudanese civil war in exchange for hoping that they would get some sort of arms shipment. And I know right now the big thing that's happening is the Czech Republic is trying to secure the 800,000 shells for Ukraine. Okay, so you sent me a screenshot from a Le Monde article, so I'll just go ahead and pull that up.
Yeah. So Le Monde is the paper of France, right? The thing is the French have a smaller force than what the Ukrainians used to defend Avdiivka, right? And you have to ask yourself, what good is it for the French to play some, I don't know, um, non-military but tactical role in helping the Ukrainian army, I don't know, drive stuff around the country. Like, honestly, for that, Ukraine has enough people to do something like that. If anything, the Ukrainians would want them involved directly in the conflict, up close and personal. It wouldn't be for just some kind of, and like the fact of the matter is, you look at 3 HIMARS destroyed this week. Um, 4 Patriot systems destroyed in a little over a week. There's a very good likelihood those systems. One of the Patriots was a German export, by the way. So there's a very good chance that those crews in there they're not Ukrainians, particularly the HIMARS, right? And those 2 HIMARS that were destroyed, sorry, the Patriot system that was destroyed, there was an entire convoy. Only 1 car of the 6 made it out. If you see the video footage, the sort of black and white thermal imaging footage of the attack, so they're already, and that could be why France is doing this sort of thing. But as we were saying off air, there's something very odd about everything that has happened in the last 2 weeks, which is basically everything that's happened on the heels of Russia gaining Avdiivka. And that is Victoria Nuland goes to visit, and I believe, was she in Kiev just before or just after? I think it was just before.
Yes, just before.
Just before Avdiivka fell. Just before. So sometime before the morning of the 17th of February, right? A week later, Macron announces that he's canceling his visit to Kiev, right? And then Avdiivka falls to the Russians, and 1 or 2 weeks later, at the most, he starts making noise about sending troops to Ukraine. We'll get into the Nuland thing, but there's just something odd about that. Why did he cancel? Baerbock went, Mitsotakis went, Nuland went, lots of other, EU politicians have gone. I don't understand why he had to cancel. I don't think he was doing anything particularly important except making these statements.
No, I don't think so either. The entire situation surrounding that is just strange, to say the least, and I really don't have any other words for that. But
like, if he would have gone and made those statements would be taken maybe more seriously. But he didn't go. And that tells you maybe he's serious about these statements. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt, because he did walk back some of this. But then there was some kind of a conference at the Palace of Élysée, and there were also other EU members outside of France that were there. And, the story got leaked by both the right-wing and left-wing factions of the French Parliament. So, he just goes back to insisting that he's going to do something about it, especially if Kiev or Odessa are threatened. I mean, it's kind of like, he is sending armaments there. There was a video from Paris, and the train goes right through a place where you would wait for your subway train. And it does have armored cars on it, the two-wheel variety, like the really, really small BTRs that the Russians and the Ukrainians have, that kind of stuff. But as it so often happens with him, he makes a pledge in order for the other countries to catch up with him. But then what he sends over is kind of trite. Remember the 10 wheeled tanks that he sent, and like they were literally all destroyed in 2 weeks. And the Ukrainians hated using them, and on 2 occasions they just abandoned them. So is he doing something like this? But then, you were talking about Moldova, and that he's also placing troops there, just as the Americans did. So
Well, the biggest thing that confuses me on Moldova here, and don't get me wrong, I understand there are a number of complicating factors to this, Transnistria being only one of them. But with all the absurd statements that have been made, at least since the beginning of this war, if not going back further, and the quote unquote fear that Moldova is going to be next, you're already seeing the mainstream media headlines put out this kind of tripe. But would not the logical move be to finally force the issue of reintegration into Romania? Romania,
mm,
NATO member, EU member, there is that. I understand there's a massive wealth gap between the two. Face similar situation with the reunification of Germany, although that was under much more peaceful and amicable circumstances, and there were less muddy waters when it came to the reunification of Germany. I do understand that, and I don't want to just use that as a default model, but just for the sake of example. And the insistence on putting troops into Moldova, getting Moldova in the EU, NATO, realistically, and I don't know, perhaps I'm wrong about this, just looking at this from a pragmatic standpoint, if they do want to do this, would it not make the most sense to cut their losses on Transnistria and force integration on the let's be the majority of Moldova? Transnistria is a very small strip of
yeah,
land, and I is that a quote unquote red line that they fear the Russians will escalate the war over this? Because it doesn't seem like when it comes to the provocation of Russia they really care at this point. That I think that's been shown very clearly
hmm
now. But the West is in the worst combination of jingoism and irrationalities. There's because being belligerent, saber rattling is one thing. Perhaps it's ill advised at some points, and I would say at many points. But it can serve a purpose, and it can further a goal. But over the past 2 years, and I would say actually going back to 2014, particularly on the Russia issue, it has been aimless. It has been projecting power just for the sake of projecting power in service of no greater goal. And the situation in Moldova just does seem like another one of these scenarios. And perhaps they want to provoke the Russians into somehow pushing all the way through to Odessa and then opening up a front in Moldova just to make them look even more frightening. In which case, that also creates a bit of a it creates a bit of a paradox, I suppose is the best word for NATO, where they are this bastion against Russian aggression. They're supposed to be the force of security and peace on the European continent. Yet they failed in Ukraine, and they would fail in Moldova. And in many ways, it shows them to be a very impotent organization. Now, look, I know that the Ukraine war was never about Ukraine winning. It was just about Ukraine softening up Russia in event of a future conflict. And I do sincerely believe that if they had the capability to launch a wider war on Russia, they certainly would. And that Ukraine is just that cannon fodder, just an initial sacrifice, just something they're going to throw into the meat grinder. I don't think that's really anything new, but it.
yeah. I mean, France did sign a defense pact with Moldova.
I
I
mean,
think a lot of
that's.
this is basically about Transnistria.
I think it absolutely is, and I do think that despite all of this, the Ukrainians are still after the massive arms stockpiles that are in Transnistria, especially when it comes to the shells, especially when it comes to artillery, because once again, it is packed full of that. Now, in terms of the heavier stuff, tanks, aircraft, of course, Transnistria isn't going to have that, but they do want to push that issue. They do want access to those arms stockpiles because that's really it's really all they can do at this point is beg for more arms. I know that the situation's still up in the air with them begging for the unfreezing of the funds in their transfer to Ukraine, the Russian assets, 300 billion that were in the West that have been frozen since the beginning of the war. And I want to be clear, not that the position was ever very coherent in the first place when it came to the West's approach to Ukraine, but it seems to grow exponentially more incoherent as time goes on. And look, I can't make rhyme or reason of it. Now, you can say, sure, the Russian goals in Ukraine are vague, but you can generally make out what they are if you just apply a little bit of research to the situation. But at this point, I don't know what the West want. I don't even think that Western leaders know what they want to do going forward. And on top of that, I think a large part of that is the fact that it is, yes, an election year in the United States. And the situation, I'm not saying Trump was some bastion of anti-NATO sentiment. Sure, there was the common diplomatic disputes combined with Trump's boisterous personality is one thing, but they, whether warranted or unwarranted, the European establishment does fear a second Trump presidency, especially in the light of the Ukraine situation. And they know that the Ukraine situation is going to have a major impact on the U.S. elections. And so the situation, since late last year, beginning of this year, has become very muddied and incoherent. I would say it's been extremely muddy and incoherent ever since the fall of Bakhmut. Everyone really started to lose grasp on the narrative. What exactly are we saying here? What exactly we're supposed to be presenting here? It just become a it's just become a nightmare in the West where early on, sure, it was easy to support Ukraine, give them arms, push back the Russians. Look, a successful counteroffensive. This is all the more reason to support them. But when the tide starts turning back in Russia's favor, they've completely lost any sort of coherence, and they're just it's as if there was no contingency plan. They didn't expect this to happen. And
Hmm.
who knows, maybe you can chalk that up to overzealous officers at the Pentagon or whatever European equivalent, whatever European country equivalent we're going to discuss at that time, that they really did expect Russia to cave in on itself when faced with a slight bit of pressure. I mean, these are the same people who ran war games and ran scenarios using figures from the Iraq War, the first Iraq War in '91. That is the that is the comparison they had to the Russian military with Saddam Hussein's army in 1991. Now, look, that it was nothing to sneeze at, but as you could see from the '91 Gulf War, it was a complete rout for the Iraqi forces. And this is what they had put forth for the Russians. The Russians who, in 2008, at that point, just over a decade ago, had crushed the Georgians in 10 days. Now, I know Georgia and Ukraine are two very different countries, but the point still stands. They had a successful military campaign. Syria was a much more asymmetrical campaign, but they saw great successes in Syria, on top of the Wagner Group's interventions in Africa and other theaters in the world where they were getting real combat experience, and they still had the audacity, I suppose, to compare the situation to the Gulf War as if Ukraine was the
Hmm.
forefront of some multinational coalition. Did they expect that to happen? Did they expect when this happened that the West would suddenly be willing to take up arms? Now, look, there was the very performative action. Everyone was infatuated with Ukraine for, I don't know, about 6 months and until the first counteroffensive really fell through and the gains started to reverse. Did they expect that was going to be enough to convince Western populations to give their all in this war, if not even when it comes to boots on the ground, when it comes to transforming their countries into wartime economies in order to support this war effort? I genuinely don't know. And what I can say, and of course I don't have access to all the information here, is that it seems like they went in with a basic plan with no contingencies. And you can criticize the Russian war effort as much as you want, but even on the worst day, this was a far more thoroughly planned operation on the Russian end than it was on the Western end. I don't think anyone can deny that at this point.
Yeah, yeah. The thing is that I think the Russians suspected this war was inevitable. I think it's something that they didn't want. Maybe there were arguments about how it could proceed, what was the most favorable outcome. But there's no question that, you know, apart from like creating their own money delivery system, and of course now there is talk again of the BRICS coming up definitely this year with an alternative to SWIFT. Besides creating that for themselves so that they could weather the sanctions, of course they've been stockpiling. They've been stockpiling munitions, And I think after 2022, you can see that there's been a greater effort from their GDP towards the war. And they've all these factories that have been dormant or working at very low scale have been amped up, and they are working 24/7, and they are well outproducing the U.S. and no less than you know what is it, 25, 27 European countries. Now, granted, all of them do not make their own shells, but Russia's outproducing the U.S. plus probably five or six other countries combined. So and even that old refrain about Iran is supplying them. Iran supplies them very little now because the Russians have several get on to drone factories and Lancet factories now. Both those models have been greatly improved. So you know um, I think the Russians were ready for it, and I think the hubris, the American and European hubris. I won't say so much the European hubris, but I would say like the American and British hubris was really strong because I think like if we're honest, the Europeans were very reluctant initially to get into this war, right?
Yes, there's a far more crucial bottom line for the Europeans. I think we could even see that in something like Nord Stream, and
Yes.
and just even to go back to the difference between Merkel and Schloss, Merkel, you have to remember, wasn't exactly installed. It wasn't a major election rigging, but Merkel was backed by the Americans to displace Schroeder, who was on very good terms with Putin. And
Yeah.
the early mid 2000s coalition you did see forming in Europe, where Putin was on very good terms with Schroeder, with Chirac, with Berlusconi. Once again, the major players in Europe there, not so much Tony Blair, of course, not Tony Blair, but there was a real possibility of some sort of mutual understanding. If I'm not going to go as far as saying alliance, but at least a mutual understanding between the continental Europeans and the Russians at that point. So you do see Merkel coming to power. I think that was around 2007, 2008. Correct me if I'm wrong there. Who very much was an Atlanticist. Don't get me wrong, but also respected the business interests of Germany, coming from the more quote unquote conservative wing of the German political spectrum, where she allowed projects like Nord Stream. She allowed the business ties they had with Russia. And then, of course, you have this doddering idiot Schloss come along, and Nord Stream blows up. He's completely subservient to the American will in this conflict, where you're right, the Europeans were much more reluctant, but in terms of actual backbone to resist, we're not talking about, once again, Schroeder or Chirac or Berlusconi or these people. Not that they were like quote unquote really big. I don't know. Maybe Berlusconi was. He was a pretty funny guy, all things considered. But not that these were any spectacular politicians. But when it came to U.S. European relations, they had far more of a backbone with that. And the current crop of European elites simply does not have that backbone, and that's why they were dragged into this.
Hmm.
And look, I just want to clarify my previous statement that, as I was saying even before this, Iraq and Russia, very different conflicts here. And I don't know, maybe had people who at least shared the viewpoints of those three were in power today, they still would have been dragged along. Now, I think it would have been a much more difficult process to convince them to go along with this. They probably would have caved eventually, but we saw almost immediate compliance from the European powers on this. Like I said, I'm not saying that they were eager for this. I'm not saying it was their project. They were reluctant, yes, but when the Anglo-American masters called the shots, they went along with them because what else was going to happen? We weren't going to see some major defection from at least any of the big countries. Now, Hungary once again doesn't count. That's a different political situation entirely. And on that same vein, a country like Slovakia, these minor nations, they don't have the sway to really flip European politics like that. So it doesn't count. But I'm glad you brought up that distinction between the continent and the Anglosphere, because I think that's something that often gets glazed over.
Yeah. I just wanted to bring up some other news because I think we should also cover the situation with Germany with Scholz. You know, Galloway's victory. Like all these things
Yeah, and then we'll get
have
in.
an important confluence.
Yeah.
But before we do that, I just wanted to say that so we haven't heard about one in a long time, not probably since October or November, but there was a young woman who was killed by the Ukrainians in Zaporozhye, who was part of some kind of um, election committee, and so her car was booby trapped. Uh, in is it Ignistia, the name of the area in southern Russia next to Dagestan?
I believe so,
So
yes.
so there was a firefight there. There were some terrorists, or these are rebels who want to break away, and there were about four or five of them who were liquidated, and then another guy in Zaporozhye was caught before he made his bomb. So all this kind of stuff happening in the background is still there. There was in St. Petersburg a small apartment building, like a low rise, like 3 or 4 floors. That was attacked by drones, and you know how the first drones that hit St. Petersburg last year, everybody thought like, how could they fly over Belarusian territory and not get noticed? I mean, anything's possible, but I think by now, we all know these are coming from Baltic countries. It's Baltic countries that are sending these drones. Uh, the Russians are being quiet about it. I can show you, like, I'll just send you a map of like the most recent attacks and where they have happened, let's say in the last few days or the last week. So you can see several of them from the 1st to 4th of March. Anyways, so that's all I've got for you know.
Yeah, for the main news out of Ukraine, I suppose at that
Yeah.
point we can get into some of the. And I'll leave that map up if you guys just want to take a look at this while we move on to the next topic here. But I suppose at that point we can move into the story about Newland just to wrap up Ukraine. And I know we just touched on a little bit, but I wanted to go in a little more depth about this because I'm still
Hmm.
left very confused about why this happens. And I do have to say, I am left with some concern given the changes that have happened with this, which I will get into. So, Newland has been dismissed from her position in the State Department, which was second to Blinken, current Secretary of State. And she was replaced with, help me with his name, John something. He was the official who
I'm
managed
looking.
the the evacuation from Afghanistan. Let me look up his name. I should have had this on record, but it's slipped my mind. Let me see here.
Campbell is his name. No, after
Uh,
Kurt Campbell is who's replacing Newland. Kurt Campbell, and he's responsible
yes,
for the Indo-Pacific policy.
and I know that John Bass, who was also instrumental in the evacuation of Afghanistan, has been put in an instrumental role in Ukraine. Let's see. He's currently, I think, the Undersecretary of State for Management. So that's once again one of these just swamp bureaucratic positions that exist. But he has been put on as one of the main replacements for Newland, not the only replacement certainly. But there is a shift in policy, and you were telling me about Newland's
Yeah.
the statement of her dismissal that had some very
Yes.
interesting. So go into that, please.
Okay. So Blinken made a short statement on video, but there was also a letter. The interesting thing is this: although she's thanked for her services, there's no regret. There's no we regret to lose Newland. which is in and of itself very interesting because this is her baby. Ukraine is her baby. She was in Odessa in the 80s when the Soviet Union was still in existence. She was already working on facilitating, Maidan and this war. So, she is no stranger to Ukraine whatsoever. Now, Kurt Campbell, who's replacing her, is also like, let's say, a Sovietologist, right? These are experts on the Soviets, the current Russia experts. Okay. Also, that woman, what is her name? Fiona, the British woman who psychologically analyzes everything Putin does.
Oh, Fiona Hill, the
She
body
was there.
language expert.
Fiona Hill, that's it. Yeah. So, like them, all of these people in their youth were in the 80s in the Soviet Union. So, the scheming, the color revolutions, the whole thing, right?
Yeah,
So,
and their ancestors from the Russian Empire, despite not being Russian. I'll leave you to figure that one
out. Weird. So, Blinken makes a big deal of the programs, but his family wasn't living there when the programs are going on. So I don't know what he's talking about. And anyhow,
he also makes a big deal about the black tank sergeant that saved his stepfather.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So, yes. So she was essentially, in my opinion, dismissed. Something came to the fore about Ukraine that she could not agree upon. This, like, Blinken is being perfectly honest about her services. They were important, and so on and so forth. There's no question about that. But the idea that the strategy for Ukraine is the same between the Biden administration and her, and only a tactical issue came about or a procedural issue came about, like, you need to finesse this, or can we do this instead of that, but the goals are the same. I can't see Nuland quitting over that. Nuland has been there from one administration to the other. She knows all these people intimately well. She's married to Robert Kagan. Kagan's brother is also married to some other well-connected people, and of course, the Kagans are friends with Anne Applebaum. All these people know each other, right? All these people have done a dozen color revolutions. They know all about this territory and the politics in this territory. They're very, very familiar with it. So for her to be dismissed,
they've dedicated their lives to this.
That's right. Her whole life is this. So, she even changed her name from Noodleman to Nuland, or her father did. In any case, as she put it, Noodleman was a very strange name in Bessarabia. You don't say. So, why? So she could not have been dismissed over a small trite issue, right? Unless there's something going on in her personal life that she prioritizes above, defeating Russia. I don't know, like, unless it's that she's leaving because there is a difference of opinion. And the difference of opinion is so large that it's not just on some tactical issue. It's strategic, it's goal-orientedly different, and she has to go. And if she leaves politics completely, she's going to end up on a think tank. And she'll babble all she wants, but she won't get the kind of hands-on praxis that she's used to having, right? She won't have the kind of clout and influence that she's used to having. So the guy that's replacing her, yes, he created AUKUS, the U.S., Australian, British Naval Defense, blah, blah, blah. Remember, that was a big thing like 4 years ago. So 3 or 4 years ago, it's about that time. And so there's a very real chance that America might be shifting towards Asia, the Asia Pacific. They certainly have the guy that has the expertise for it. Now, he's probably even more well-rounded than Nuland is because, as I said, he has a history. He has an in-depth knowledge of the Soviet Union and all the satellite states that have always historically played a role in that region ever since the imperial empire of Russia, right? So it's not like he doesn't know about that or he couldn't be used maybe even as a transition figure, but I don't even know if he'll do that. But him creating Oxus is a big deal. That's okay, and it was his advice, his tutelage to Obama that convinced Obama to go to the China pivot, the Pacific pivot. That's what all that was about. So it's a pretty big deal that has happened. Um, Macron acting, crazy. Um, it might be a cover for it. He might do something crazy. I don't know. Um, the fact is the West is kind of panicking right now, right? I think Avdiivka really did hurt them, right? Navalny dying soon after was kind of like a gift to them. It distracted the attention from Avdiivka. And remember that his lawyer, who is allowed to bring medicine to Navalny, and Navalny had medical issues, was there 48 hours before he passed away. So I mean, Navalny, if the Brits killed him, I mean, he's completely disposable. Like that's why his wife is there. His wife didn't even attend his funeral. Um, all the other dignitaries were there, from uh, the diplomats from Canada, America, Germany, Britain, Italy. There were Greece. All of them were there. So it's not like, she was going to be arrested or some other nonsense. There are no formal charges against her, but she refused to go. And the rumor is that the guy that she's, sleeping with, because she wasn't faithful to Navalny, is that Bulgarian guy, Hristo Grozev. He has a Twitter account. I remember him, and he made this ridiculous statement that he went on a tirade, not a tirade, but that wouldn't be properly characterizing it. But he went and said that it was Petrov and Boshidov that killed him. Do you remember these guys?
Yeah, here, let me
These
let me.
guys are responsible for the Skripal case. Like, imagine, like, this is so cartoonish. It's so stupid. And I don't know if these guys were the Skripal case or the two guys seen around. Remember, there was an explosion in the Czech Republic of an old ammunition depot, and everybody said it's
Yes.
the Russians. The Russians did this. And so here it is again. These guys are being blamed for killing Navalny, but uh, Christo goes even further by claiming that these two guys, when the war started, were brought in and they were going to take over the political quarter of Kiev at the beginning of the SMO. Like it's just so stupid. You can hardly, like, honestly, you can't even take it seriously. But that's who she's with, and the reason she's with him is because he's also like a regime stooge. That's their job. That's what they do.
Absolutely. And she also refused Biden's invitation to the State of the Union recently, so there was that as well. But
Mm.
just the final point on Newland is, look, I shed no tears about her being gone. Let me be clear with that. And you can chalk this next statement up to the more pessimistic outlook I have gained over the years. But much like the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I do believe that this is a sign of worse things to come. Now, you might think, well, how can Newland being gone be any worse than the current situation? Well, I didn't think the clown show in Afghanistan ending could have been the sign of a worse situation, but Less than a year later, we saw outbreak, and 6 months later, we saw the outbreak of all-out war in Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying the two events are directly connected, but there is a tenuous connection there, and we can get into that. But I do fear with Newland gone, and as you said, it had to be a major divergence, barring any sort of personal issue. It had to be a major divergence in approach towards not only Ukraine but American foreign policy in general that would lead to her leaving the administration, her leaving the State Department. And if somebody else is assuming that role, then we went into the credentials of her replacements. It it does suggest, in my opinion, something worse is on the horizon. Now, what that will look like, how long that will take to manifest, it, those details are still up in the air. I need to see how this situation develops further, how the situation changes in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and in the Asia Pacific before I make any definitive statement on that. But I just have to say, just based on gut feeling, my position on this is that they have something even more drastic in the works right now.
Mm, interesting.
But with that being said, the unless you have any further comment on that, I
I
suppose
mean, what do you think?
I look. I know. I think it was back in November, December. I was speculating about the Korean situation. Now that has since calmed down, but the potential of them trying to trip some wire in East Asia
Mm,
is not out of the possibility. Now I know that most people would say Taiwan, 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 and there's a lot of tension on Taiwan, but I still firmly maintain, and I might have to eat my hat on this one, but I still firmly maintain that the position of mainland China, the position of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party of China, whatever term you want to put to the polity that controls mainland China, is that they are still interested in a diplomatic solution and a bloodless solution to the Taiwan situation because they still do think it is achievable. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, maybe not even 10 years, but I still do think that given the dynamics, they think that a political resolution of the Taiwan situation is still within the cards. So, unless there's any major provocation from the American, from the Western side, I don't foresee anything like that happening. And then we look at the other hotspots in East Asia. There's Korea, which is always on the brink of war. For being honest, has been since '53. Then there's the situations going on in Southeast Asia. One might think the situation with Myanmar and the perpetual problems there. And some of that spilled into Thailand a little bit a few years ago. Now, nothing much really came of that. Then, of course, there is the South China Sea, Philippines, Vietnam, that area. So there are a number of flashpoints that we could see a crisis in East Asia kick off. Now, I will admit my knowledge and my overview of Europe, and particularly Eastern Europe, is much more informed than my overview of the Asia Pacific. So some of my analysis may be lacking here. Look, I certainly by no means try to ignore this. I like to cover this because it is a major theater, but I have to say, in terms of my knowledge base, it's far less than when we deal with situations in Europe. I will fully
mm,
Europe and the Middle East. I will fully admit that those two are my strong suits, whereas Asia Pacific I'm actually a little bit lacking on. But given the situation, it doesn't seem like China at this point can really be provoked because there are internal issues as there is with every country. You can point to the economic issue, you can point to some of the demographic issues, and they'll harp on this. China has 5 years before it collapses, but once again, they've been saying that since 2000 at least. They do the same thing with Russia. It's a very easy write off. Oh well, they're on the brink of collapse anyway. So I just dismiss those claims out of hand. But ever since I would say the mid 20 teens, this things have been going very well for China. They haven't had many setbacks. Even the whole COVID thing that was supposed to bring them down because it leaked from one of their labs still has yet to happen. Trade with China, with countries across the world, continues to increase. Now there has been some reshoring of American industry because of the recent situation with China, but once again, China is still a massive manufacturing hub. they have improved relations with several of the other major powers, particularly India. The way that Chinese-Indian relations have smoothed over in the past 5 years has been remarkable because they still have that flashpoint. They still do have that disputed border, and many people expected that to be a major point of contention. And China and India also historically do not have good relations. But for the time being, at least that front is smoothed over. I don't know. Maybe that is the next target of the State Department in 5 to 10 years, where they try to exploit that gap. But once again, when it comes to what they have to offer, there's simply not that where economic pragmatism is winning out in that end. Not that trade relations between India and China are too strong, but pragmatism is winning out there over the traditional rivalry because there is no strong counterbalance. Not to say the West is in terminal decline, even though I do think in many ways it is, but geopolitically, America still has a lot of weight to throw around. It has embarrassed itself. It has lost a lot of that. It has shown itself to be a fool on many occasions, especially as of the past 4 years. But they still do have quite a bit of weight to throw around. Let's not be mistaken about that. And getting back to my ultimate point, that if we are to believe that this is another pivot to Asia, especially in an election year, I with how unhinged they've shown themselves in their approach towards Russia, anything is really possible when it comes to any of the tripwires they might try to set off in East Asia. Like I said, I think China is a much more reserved country about this than Russia because at a certain point, just given the dynamics between the two, Russia had to act in Ukraine in order to maintain any sort of legitimacy as a global
Oh
power.
yeah.
Any morality, any question of was the war justified or not, put that aside. In terms of raw power politics, Russia had to act in Ukraine in order to preserve its legitimacy. Otherwise, it would have just been a slow road into decline. But China, I do not think is in that position, despite the Taiwan thing, despite the fact that they had the stunt with Pelosi going to Taiwan about what was that, 6 months ago, a year ago, I can't even remember, but it was sometime last year. And those sort of things happen. And while I wouldn't say it makes China look strong, it doesn't necessarily make them look weak either. It's once again, East Asia is the nothing ever happens region of the world, but with how unhinged the State Department has shown itself in Russia, I do think that in many ways they do want to try to replicate this formula into East Asia, given the failures of their enterprises in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe. I'm not saying they're going to abandon that project completely, but I do think with how much of an embarrassment it's become, how little progress has been made, they are desperately trying to shift focus from this. And also in the Middle East, where because of particularly the political coalition the liberal establishment has created in the West, they have to be very careful about the Middle Eastern situation, where they can't strongly lean towards one side or another, despite the fact that Israel is going to ultimately do whatever it wants, but they're going to be there to finger wag and say, "Oh, well, of course we condemn this." But once again, rhetorically, they have to strike a very careful balance. But if they pivot to East Asia, once again, it's conservative bait number one. A lot of right wingers. I'm not saying you have to love China or anything, but a lot of people will buy into throwing away their own self interest in order to get one over on China. Unfortunately, um, so it'll do that. It will solidify the right as the political situation gets worse at home, where it's an easy sell to them, especially if they can get another right winger, an acceptable right winger back in power. Whether that's a compromised version of Trump or somebody else, who knows? Now, insofar as the 2024 elections, I don't want to start making speculations on winners and outcomes and potential things that could go wrong with that just yet. I do think we're a little bit early for that, but it also shows that look, there's a lot more of a case you can make for an American rival with China than you can with Russia. So there's a lot more selling points there. And like I said, the State Department has become unhinged enough where I think it is willing to do something like that. I'm not going to say anything just outright because the
Hmm.
situation is still too new to develop with Newland leaving and with her replacements coming in and his credential, what was that, Fisk, whatever his name was, and I just have to say, given the fact that they have tripped off the other two flashpoints, that being Russia and the Middle East, Europe and the Middle East, and particularly Russia, and Israel-Palestine with Yemen. Uh, I don't know. Maybe they're going to try to reignite Syria. I doubt that. In fact, it looks like they're going the exact opposite direction in Syria and in the Levant and in that area. But East Asia is the only thing that really strikes a chord. It seems like nobody really cares about the situation in Latin America anymore. Venezuela used to be all the rage that we were supposed to go down there and put Guaido in power and make sure that Maduro falls. That's just completely fallen through. Nobody really cares about that. Nobody cares about the Cuba situation, insofar as it still really exists. I mean, not that I have particularly strong feelings on it at this point either. It's just, I, I'll be honest, I don't care about these 20th century regimes or these extras of these 20th century regimes, but I think a lot of Americans would concur, regardless of their personal opinion on them, that in terms of what actually matters, it's pretty low on the priority list there. Africa, need I say more? But there's just so many flashpoints in East Asia with different temperaments of actors in Europe that it does make it really hard to pin down. But I do fear an escalation there over the course of the next, I would say, just to put a rough time frame on it, 2 years.
Interesting. They like, of course, there's pivotal countries like Vietnam, right? But I just think that the Asia is so pragmatic that they're not going to go for this.
Well, yeah, that's exactly the problem. The Chinese are too
Yeah.
good a businessmen for something like this to happen.
But I just think, Asia as a as a civilization, right, which would include China, but it would include Japan and Korea. I understand that they have their differences, but these people also have a way of going about things that is very different from the rest of the world, and they're as you say, they're very pragmatic. So, I mean, one thing that you hear from the Americans is that after 2.5 decades, more investment has flowed into the U.S. than in China. Now, is this preparation, or is this like, with Biden skewing the facts here and there to make? I mean, all politicians do this. Is it really serious? I don't know. Certainly, like, America losing Ukraine is a big deal, and it is about America losing Ukraine. America can say it can pretend that Ukraine is a sovereign country all it wants. Everybody else who doesn't live in the West knows perfectly well that it's not a sovereign country, right? It's a country that needs to be taken care of by America and the West, probably indefinitely. So I would say, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I understand like the foreboding, and maybe they will, because as my brother puts it, this is a Rothschild empire. They're not going to go down easy. So, even though one of the Rothschilds died recently, he died at 936. Can you believe it?
I was going to make a comment that I don't think YouTube will appreciate, but let's just say they have certain unconventional techniques that allows them to enjoy such long lifespan, and I'll leave you to speculate on those.
Yeah. But I suppose we should also talk about other European news.
Yeah, certainly.
Scholz again came out today. Pistorius, his defense minister.
Oh yeah, Boris Pistorius. It's these names are made up. It's all fake. It's all, you know what? I don't want to be one of it's all fake guys, but sometimes I just feel like that. And just frankly, when I hear the German defense minister is named Boris Pistorius, what else am I supposed to say here? But as you were saying, please continue. I know the story, but please do go on.
So, he came out again. Now he had this ridiculous press conference, because remember, this also fits into this strange confluence of events that have been happening since the end of February till now, right? These last 3-4 weeks. Nuland goes to Kiev. Says we've got nasty surprises for Putler. Then she quote unquote quits. Dignitaries going to and presidents and politicians of the EU going to Kiev. Macron refuses, doesn't go.
Oh, and then also the ambassadors of various nations that were summoned by Lavrov in order to
That's right, refused.
refused to go. And
yes, yeah, and it was he asked the UN to do that. That tells you like the UN is like it's a fake neutral meant to convince people that like it's kind of like its role is kind of like what the conservatives do in liberal democracies, right? They're there to lose, and then, but strangely, in their loss and acceptance of the leading liberal, they validate the liberal because the liberal pretends that they're going to, be patient and give the benefit of the doubt, maybe, to the conservative. And as the UN functions the same way, right? Like, these are the rules. Everybody has to follow them. That's their job. They're ambassadors. They're supposed to go. But suddenly there's just something that's so immoral about not interfering in Russian elections that they refuse to go, right? So, anyways, so you have all these strange events. Pistorius comes out right away and blames Russia for for disinfo. Now he doesn't say that his military staff who was speaking on unsecured lines in was it in Indonesia? It was in Indonesia, right?
it was an air show in Singapore.
In Singapore, right? And interestingly, when all this was happening, just a few days later, Singapore says the Americans have been using F-35s to assist the Ukrainians in targeting, Russian military assets and cities and so on. Right? I forget his name, but he mentioned this. He's not the prime minister, but in any case, there is a video, I believe, on Intel Slava Republic that I saw. So. Pistorius is he doesn't say that the leaks are fake, that Lexus and Vova made this up. No, they're real, but he calls it Russian disinformation. Like literally anything I don't like is Russian disinformation. Now, I have my doubts personally about this leak. You could argue, yes, the hubris is there. They believe that they can. I mean, these air shows are like conventions and meet and greets for these people, right? One representative of the German military Air Force goes and talks with like another country. Hey, we've got a plane you might be interested in, so forth and so on. But these guys are discussing like really, they're discussing things that aren't pertinent to the air show. They could have discussed them on secured lines just a day or two later, right?
Yeah, but you've touched one of my okay, fixations is an exaggeration, but one of my passions, which is aviation. Because
yes,
we're talking about air shows here, and I've been to
yep.
a few in my day, not as many as I would have liked to, but a few. And yeah, well, once again, now of course they put these massive aircrafts on display, some of them on the ground just for people to gawk at, myself included. They let you touch them and everything. It's very nice. You should go if you ever get the chance. It's a very fun thing to do.
I've been to 2 air shows.
Yeah, I love it. There's a big one around me every year, but I digress. But point being is like anyone do. Now, of course, like if you start like getting too close, they're gonna shoo you away. But it's a good chance for anyone who really otherwise wouldn't to look at these aircraft. So once again, as much as I love air shows, they are filled with glow in the darks. Don't get me wrong, and that you do see like high. Now, not people you'd recognize, but you do see like people who you can recognize are of importance. Now they usually have these big box seats, and it's like any other major events where they do come. It's a very good forum for these kind of people to meet each other when it comes to the head of industries, governments, militaries. It's just something that happens, especially when you get like these major air shows like the one in Singapore. That's what happens. But as you were saying, when it came to discussion of this topic in particular, this could have happened at any other time. This was just a pure OPSEC failure if we're to believe that this wasn't a fake plan, if we're to believe that this wasn't some sort of we're going to, out op the op or whatever nonsense. But like you said, there wasn't even any denials of what was said. So
Yeah, yeah.
it's a very strange situation.
It is, and even not Johnson, um, who am I thinking? I'm thinking of the former British Prime Minister who's a Lord now. His
Not Cameron, no.
Cameron.
Oh, it is
Cameron
yes.
today made a statement that the British have no intent on going into Ukraine. So, I mean, in a way, the Western leaders look a little bit silly, and then you have Galloway winning his riding. Okay, it was a by-election, less of a turnout during a by-election. It was in an area that he was probably going to win anyways, but it's how he won. He won overwhelmingly, and I mean, Labor came in. No, the Tories came in third. Second was an independent, and Labor came in third. Tories came in fourth, and second place went to an independent. And Galloway took the lion's share of the votes. I think over 50. So the night he wins, Rishi Sunak gives a speech about extremism and the extremism on the left and the right threatening to tear the country apart. He does it at 10 Downing Street, right? That's his residence as a prime minister. But why is he addressing everybody at 10 Downing Street? That's like for an emergency. That's like if a major I mean, not even all of the terrorist attacks that happen in Britain were ever there was never an announcement that happened at 10 Downing Street unless there's a war. It's the most it's reserved for the most serious of actions, right? And I guess he thinks Galloway winning is very serious. And I guess we'll eventually talk about Biden, but angry Biden, Biden is never coherent unless he's angry. He's never coherent, and some people have said that he might have been on Adderall or something because it has some anti-aging properties. And after the speech, you see him like wandering around. But all to say, right now, I think the Western leaders are at a bit of a loss as to what to do. I think they do sense that Ukraine is in big trouble, and that they can't afford to lose it, that they will lose face. And just as Russia losing, let's say, Crimea, sets in motion an inevitable decline, America losing Ukraine does the same thing for the West.
Absolutely. And I would the Sunak thing just it kills me. I don't know other way to put it. That he, I mean, even just speaking purely from a political strategic standpoint, he has inflamed the situation far worse by addressing it than just leaving it alone. Is would
Yeah.
have it would have
It's kind of like
ruffled
the
some
same thing with
feathers.
Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. It would have ruffled some feathers, but ultimately it would have been lost the news cycle. But this is something, if especially they're going to keep pressing the issue, and I'm glad you brought up Trump because he's the prime example of this. If they're the more they press the issue, the worse it's going to get for them. The more this is going to metastasize. And once again, I'm left questioning political strategy here. Regardless of agree, disagree with the message, whatever. I'm left wondering what was the point of this, just from a pragmatic standpoint? What were what were you hoping to accomplish? What was this supposed to
Well, I think
result in?
I think he's basically listening to, if you listen to what he said and you pair that with the Sky News reporter who interviewed Galloway after his victory, right? He says, "Well, we've been on the streets of Rochdale, and a lot of people are very concerned." And he brings up the Jewish community, right? And that's who I think is pushing Sunak to speak. That's why it's so incongruent
Oh, certainly.
that they would have a flip out over just Galloway winning, right? Um, they're even proposing to pass laws that PMs would be dismissed if they were found amongst protesters.
And
I mean, MPs.
yeah,
Um,
I'm glad you brought this up, because this is rather par for the course for the Jewish community. Rather than taking these things in stride, rather than taking a look at the big picture, their first instinct is to panic. Now, look, I know there's a lot of talk about their political influence and whatever, and once again, we've touched on these questions. We certainly haven't shied away from them. But I do think people do take a very extreme issue on this, whether it doesn't happen at all, or they're hegemonic and there's no assailing them, and that it's just untouchable power. Whereas, yeah, okay, they're a powerful block of people, but they're not invincible. They are
yeah,
this the fact that they are a powerful block is not something that's written to the rules of reality, and that has to stay this way forever. And I'm not advocating any action or lack thereof. And make your own political decisions here. I'm just here to talk about what happened, my opinion on it. But point being is that whenever they sense any upheaval, their first reaction is to just clamp down. They can't. I don't want to speak universally, because once again, I understand there's a lot of bickering factions when it comes to this. And we look no further than the Israel issue, but it does seem like across the board, their first reaction is to clamp down, not to take a moment, not to assess the situation. When they do smell any sort of resistance that does have even the slightest bit of viability, it just needs to just be suppressed. And I think that, frankly, once again, talking purely strategically, that is a discredit to them. That is something that does not play in their favor in the long term. But I
yeah.
agree that now that you brought up that's
Well,
exactly
I
the
have
reason
an
behind it.
interesting excerpt from an article by Abe Foxman, the former, um, I think he was head of the ADL,
Certainly.
um, and he writes, Israel has become the Jew among the nations. The deteriorating relationship between Israel and its one and only most important ally, the United States, and how the Jewish people will react to its expulsion of anti-Semitism at the end of the day, Foxman told the Times of Israel. We're fine now, but what happens if it continues? How will it end? And how will we survive? He wondered on the eve of the centerpiece events of the ADL's Never Is Now conference in New York. Oh, by the way, there's a meeting in Toronto, but there's also in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, for people interested in buying property in Israel. Of course, you have to be Jewish.
I can
After
fake
50
that
years of
paperwork.
dealing with this subject, the answer is no. I'm not surprised, because those of us dealing with the subject professionally understood a long time ago that anti-Semitism is a disease without an antidote and without a vaccine. We reported on it. We monitored it. We recorded it. We knew that it was there, that it was deep, and that it was serious. I mean, there's just no recognition of their actions. The organized Jewish community developed a containment strategy. If we can't eliminate anti-Semitism, at least let's contain it, Foxman said. Keep it in the sewers with the cover on. This means is using every means available: media, coalitions, memory of the Shoah, the truth, the threats of litigation. The containment strategy, Foxman contends, fell apart because two major factors: the internet and the endorsement of the end of civility in American discourse. Foxman called the internet probably the most significant instrument that has given legitimacy to anti-Semitism. It has given a superhighway and a level of anonymity more than we ever could have imagined. When it comes to civility in America, Foxman isn't afraid
to use the T word, Trump. The lack of civility in America came as a result of Trumpism. Trump legitimized it, Foxman said. Once he broke all the taboos, it was acceptable. And what's not, we, the Jews, were the first to go. It's ridiculous. Shocked by the intensity of the hate. We studied it. We knew it. It was coming from left and right. But what surprised me was the intensity of the hate and the intensity of the silence. I'm shocked that you cannot find 10 organizations that we, the Jewish community, have stood within the last 50 years who stood up clearly and with us in this moment. Yeah, that's right. Like you literally killed 13,000 children in 4 months, and you think they should stand with? It's just preposterous. I'd hear of a Jewish person donating 20 billion to a university and ask them, "What condition did you put on it?" Now this is such a red herring because even according to Norman Finkelstein, all of them put conditions on their contributions to the universities and have done so for decades. It's so ridiculous, right? I'm not going to go on with the rest of the article, but um, maybe as a segue, I'll say that he's of course exaggerating and omitting everything, and he expects to be heard and sympathized with, naturally.
Oh, of course,
And
our
it's not just
greatest
for a
ally.
Jewish audience. But, Biden received more standing ovations than Benjamin Netanyahu. And it's this kind of fake consensus that is there for the viewer to arrive at the conclusion that what is being said is hugely important and, of course, correct, right? It's asking for compliance. Like that's the whole point of having, I don't know how many, like 2 standing ovations per 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. It's a preposterous amount of standing ovations. That makes no sense. And I just think that's interesting, that the same thing that happened every time Netanyahu visited Congress is the same thing that happened during Biden's address.
Yeah, it does figure. I figured with that we should move into Biden's address just to round out the show here. And with that, and once again, I'll get into this talk about the quote unquote humanitarian port they're going to open in Gaza, but and some of the action because it does tie back in Biden's speech. But we actually delayed the show in interest of listening to this, so because
Yeah.
we were going to record Thursday night, and then we remembered that Biden was supposed to give his State of the Union. Friday, a scheduling conflict came up, so here we are Saturday night, and you'll be listening to this Sunday during the day. If you're listening at the premiere, which case, if you are, welcome, and thank you once again. But the speech is exactly what I expected it to be. Now, he came in with a rather strong, I guess is word for it, opening, where he just came right out of the gate on foreign policy, talking about how democracy is under. He compared himself to FDR and Lincoln because democracy is both under assault at home and abroad. So I'm like FDR and Lincoln combined. So you gotta love me. Was the opener to his speech, which was just I wanted to puke within the first 2 minutes. If I'm being honest, and I'm surprised I didn't. I had to half pay attention to even make it through it. So forgive me if some of my details are spotty. I did go back and review some of the content, but I will say I could only take it in doses. It was one of those kind of things.
Mhm.
So he did that. He opened with that strong statement, and then he pivoted quickly into domestic policies. And I'll be honest, a lot of it sounded copy pasted right from his last State of the Union from 2023, and I mean, that's to be expected. A lot of the State of the Union, you will go back, you even listen to some of what Trump says. It's a lot of just meandering on domestic issues, whether that be he wagged his finger at the Republicans over the border. He went on talking about manufacturing for a little bit, talked about just cost of living, all that kind of stuff, and gave the same boilerplate statements. Talked about it was very vague when he talked about wealth and taxation. Didn't propose a certain taxation. It talked about the rich, quote unquote, paying their fair share. Which, once again, I'm not here to run cover for the American elite, but all that talk is just vagary, and we all know that it's all just politicking and nonsense in that same vein. But the he didn't falter. He was angry Joe throughout the speech. He was yammering, and he was actually a little bit belligerent. Where there were moments he would actually engage with the hecklers, which doesn't usually happen in these kind of events. Because I remember particularly when the border came up, he was scolding them. There was some heckling, and then he was like responding to the heckling. I mean, you could say that made him look weak, but I think that's up for debate, depending on how you want to spin the situation. But there was no Bidenisms. There was no referring to Egypt as Mexico or Mexico as Egypt. There was no stammering and muttering their words. It was, like I said, he was on his rage pills, whether that was Adderall, whether that was something else. But he made it through. There was an interesting thing when it came to that the woman who was recently victim of murder at the hands of a illegal immigrant, where there was a little bit of a dispute over that, and people got mad because he used the term illegal immigrant, and that caused more discord on the left, which is always nice to see. It's always nice to see these people at each other's throats. I'm not gonna lie if I say I don't take some enjoyment in that, but like it was remarkable in how unremarkable it is because you have a president in such a weak position and such an unpopular position, and he still managed to give one of the most boilerplate speeches I've ever heard. Like I said, aside from the strong and arguably unhinged open where he declared himself FDR Lincoln, it was pretty lackluster aside from the disputes over immigration and the illegal immigrant murder case that's been in the news as of late. But he also brought up the other major point that I think stuck out beyond just droning on about domestic policy was that he authorized the humanitarian port in Gaza, the flotilla. There, of course, were the American airdrops of aid into Gaza. Now, much in the fashion of the decline in competence just of American institutions and Western institutions as a whole, of course, some of these packages had parachute malfunctions and they came as falling objects, and there were casualties. There was a death count because of this, and that's where we're at now. The fact that we couldn't even do a proper airlift of basic supplies, something we've done numerous times, but I do think, and I'll get into some of his comments that were cut on a hot mic as he was walking out. Of course, because as the president walks in and walks out, there's all the people who are badgering him, trying to get his ear, trying to talk to him about whatever. But when he brought that up, I do think it does signal, because he did focus on that for a little bit, that they are desperately trying to distance themselves from Israel, from Netanyahu, at least in an optical sense. Of course, Israel is always going to get the backing. Israel is going to do whatever it wants. There's really no stopping that. At least from a Western perspective, Israel has their full support, regardless of what they might say. But he is desperate in terms of putting this together and trying to make it look like he is taking action. He's trying to provide humanitarian aid in order to wash America's hands of this and pass it off as an Israeli problem, that we're just a party committed to peace and humanitarian work in the region. Now, is that going to work? I don't know. It's still a long way to November, which is what we really have to keep our eye on with this when it comes to the election season coming up. And it's still March. There's a lot that can happen. The national conventions for each respective party haven't been had yet. There's still speculation that Biden will be switched last minute at the DNC, which I'm gonna need to see a lot more proof of something like that before I sign on to that theory. But it's not the most insane thing I've ever heard, especially seeing how Biden performs cognitively in the next few months. I know Trump actually just released an ad today of all of Biden's just blunders and just falling over him, tripping over his own words. Just pointing out that this is clearly an old man in severe cognitive decline who is not capable of even just the day-to-day responsibilities of a head of state. But that's aside the point. But Biden is trying to put a neat bow on his disastrous is too dramatic of a word for this, but his very unsuccessful, just to use a more muted term for this, first term in office. Trying to put a neat bow on this, that's what the speech was. And trying to make himself appear like somebody with resolve, like somebody who still has a functional brain, and somebody who can lead the country forward into the next 4 years and beyond, perhaps. Not suggesting he can stay in office, but the idea that him and his lieutenants can continue governing beyond this point. But it was strange because, of course, they always talk about how they want to give a unifying speech. That's what they love to harp on. But a lot of the domestic policy was just browbeating of Republicans, browbeating of the right, which
And
was
the Supreme Court.
Yeah, it was to be expected. Oh yeah, he had that big shame on you moment with the justices, and well, I will say he did seem strong in his resolve and that he did not falter. What really I do think happened is it showed his weaknesses as an executive, where he didn't have command over these people. He didn't have the influence that is typically carried with the presidential office that one would have expected to have. I would say up until at least the Obama era, maybe even a little after that, depending on how you want to evaluate Trump's performance as an executive, regardless of what your thoughts are on what he did while in office, but just his abilities of performance. But he didn't command the gravitas of a president in that moment. It was somebody who was dealing with a slipping political system, and arguably a slipping coalition, really trying to browbeat everyone back into line. Why are the Republicans not cooperating? Why are they not a good controlled opposition party? Why is the Supreme Court daring to defy my political agenda? Why did you overturn Roe v. Wade? Why are you making me look bad? And it did come off as that, as somebody who was really trying to fight for at least the rhetorical consolidation of his power at a moment when his support is slipping, even among people who traditionally would support him and his party. And like I said, they were able, fortunately for his sake, to avoid any real bad Biden moments, any real bad senility moments. But it did come off as somebody who is fighting an uphill battle when it comes to forming a political coalition, and frankly, just the ability to govern.
Yeah, and as I said, he can only be coherent when he's angry like this, and being angry like this isn't normal. Like, I don't know what authority people want to place to show like the Durand, but when Alexander Mercurius said, even during the American Civil War, Lincoln did not berate the members of the Congress who were, of course, with the South. Right. I mean, I think there's just a degradation of like civility that's been going on in the West for quite some time now. Like, you could say for decades and decades, maybe even a century. But even Roosevelt wasn't like this, and a lot of people felt Roosevelt was like, some crypto commie. But it didn't, like, I would say since 2014, 15, it really has been like this. There is a very serious division, and again, it's like what I said earlier about adopting, let's say, a tone that is completely unapologetic, embraces victimhood, so you can't berate them or criticize them.
The, the way you increase the effect of standing ovations, like how can you consider like 30% of everything Biden said deserving of a standing ovation? You can't, but the whole point is to send a message. Just like Abe Foxman, you know, crying about, well, the lack of support, and not like putting the obvious two and two together to understand why. He knows very well why. So, you know, when I was watching, and I was watching on this goes way back to a channel, Dennis Dale, and he had it on like live, and and I said on the stream, I said, this rant by Biden will be considered like a tour de force. Biden wasn't fired. He was inspirational. And they said words along those lines. One of the headlines I read was, Biden gives something like energetic or robust address. The truth is, every time that he has had to perform, like really had to perform, when it was time for the Dark Biden speech or um, the debates with Trump, he generally has performed. It's a low bar, but I'm saying, very little slurring of words. He got one or two things wrong. Something about it's important to he meant to defend democracy, but he said it in such a way that it meant like defending the forces fighting against democracy. But that was, maybe one of the only slip ups. There's a few times where its words were slurred, but if you watched it right to the end, and it was not easy to do, once he calms down and he's talking to these other reps, like, I'll never forget, one of them was a guy who was there to represent an Iraqi soldier, a male Iraqi soldier, and his husband. Like,
Ugh.
This had to have been planted. Like, it's unbelievable. And of course, then there was the famous, I spoke to Netanyahu, don't tell anybody. He's saying, don't tell anybody. You can tell as soon as he started talking about Netanyahu, there's one of the young security people immediately motions over to him, touches him on the arm, and says, we should get going. But he doesn't do it in quickly enough before Biden says, Netanyahu and I are going to have a come to Jesus moment. Like, what, after 32,000 dead, you're going to have a come to Jesus moment? Like, Bush Sr., Bush Jr., Clinton, like Obama, all these people were tougher on you. Like, all of them.
Even Trump
we're
had
tougher
his
on the
falling out
Israelis.
with Netanyahu. Even they had their tension. Between Biden, it's nothing.
Right. It's nothing. It's absolutely nothing. And the whole point of Monica Lewinsky was a honey trap for Clinton. Clinton wouldn't move on certain policies that the Israelis wanted, and so Monica. That was not some organic relationship. So, anyways, yeah, the speech was kind of what I expected it would be.
Because you brought it up, you know what I think? I think they should build a
Mm.
statue of Monica Lewinsky in Albania, in Kosovo, instead of Bill
Yeah.
Clinton. That's what needs to really be done.
The most, after Azerbaijan, is the most philo-Semitic Muslim majority country there is.
So true. Thank you, USA.
Yeah.
You are my best friend.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the Biden speech will basically just cause more divisions. How many people are going to be, I don't know, so undecided when it comes time for election? Like, if the Biden administration wants to win, it has to, like, Ukraine has to give it a victory,
and he's got to build this stupid pier. Like, it has to be done, or he's going to lose it.
I know I said I
And it's
wasn't
going to,
going to get an election speculation this early, but I will make one comment as of now. At this point, I think, barring any sort of, let's just say, misconduct in the elections that may or may not have happened a few years ago, I think this election is going to be a battle of turnout rather than actual trying to win over voters, where who has a more mobilized base. And at this point, it's by far Trump. And yeah, while Biden might, and you actually even look at some of the national polls, Trump is edging out Biden in several key states and on a national average.
yeah.
And I do think that when it comes to voter enthusiasm, there's a lot more people who are going to get out there and vote and campaign for Trump than for Biden on a grassroots level. Sure, you can shove all the money, you can create all the ads you want, but at the end of the day, is that going to convince people to actually go out there and vote for Biden? I mean, the best thing that they have in their arsenal is they can talk about 4 more years of fascist, evil Trump, which at this point, even people who are disaffected, even people who don't like Trump, how many of them are sold on that narrative after his rather lackluster 4 years in office? How many of them are actually sure? There's the very core people who will never get over the Trump derangement syndrome, but even people who despise Trump, how many of them are just really apathetic towards him being in office versus Biden at this point? And I think that's a very large number of
Mm.
people.
Yeah, I agree. Plus, a lot of people that are going to vote for Trump are mobilized by the idea that the 2020 election was a sham. That Trump won that election, and they want revenge. You know.
Yes, absolutely, and it that was also something Biden touched on. It was like, oh, the election was legitimate. Like, still bringing that point up, and of course, Trump also still does hammer on that point. But it is going to be, not to dwell too much on the upcoming election. It is going to be a question of mobilization. It's going to be a question of who can actually convince people to support them. And as it stands now, I know that there's not that many Muslims in the United States. Don't get me wrong. But I do have to say, keeping my eye on Michigan, I don't know if the population of Dearborn is enough to, if there is just voters staying home, if that's enough to tip the scales in favor of Trump. And just if we're talking on a state by state basis, Michigan is one of the key states. Yes, to, either of them have to win if they want to secure this election. And at this point, when you're looking at all the Palestinian and Iraqi and Syrian and whatever Middle Eastern, particularly Middle Eastern Muslim diaspora, not that other Muslims aren't engaged on the issue of Palestine, but particularly when it comes to the Middle Eastern Muslim diaspora, in places like Michigan, in places like Minnesota. Now, of course, they're not going to flip to Trump because we all know Trump's position on Israel. They're not going to support that. But like I said, at this point, they might just see it as a futile effort. What's the point? Why? Who cares? It's not like Biden's going to deliver anything better. And this is the key issue for a lot of these people. And if we're talking demographics, yeah, that's the case when it comes to, in particular, I would say Michigan and Minnesota is where those Muslim votes can make a lot of difference. Now, some people might say, "Oh, you're insane. Minnesota will never flip Republican." I'm not necessarily saying it will, and I frankly don't think it will at this point because it is one of those blue strongholds. But if there was ever a time to flip Minnesota red, and I know I said on one of my election predictions last year, I gave that possibility, but I think I even negged on it then, and if I didn't, I will say in hindsight that was a stupid prediction. I'm willing to call myself out on that one. But just talking electoral politics, we're talking a state that is full of Somali Muslims, and I don't know how many of them are registered to vote. I don't know how many of them are eligible to vote. And once again, you could bring up questions of legitimacy, which I will not touch because I believe every election in the United States ever held is legitimate, as our YouTube overlords would want us to believe. But you do have to consider these questions, and of course, it's not only Muslims who are mobile on this issue because there's a lot of other left-wing groups of various races, including white leftists, who do tie this in with their other hang-ups, with the other points. And uh, regardless how you feel on this issue, I certainly have my opinions on on the question of Israel. When it comes to that more mobilized base of the left who are afraid of evil Trump fascist man, the propaganda they put out, when they see either inaction or failed action on the Palestinian issue, I'm far from the first person to say this. This could be the thing that just creates complete apathy among them, and that sends them home, especially among the younger, more quote unquote diverse cohorts in the United States. And I do think that, given all of that, Biden's chances, just speaking generally, I'll need to see what events happen between now and October in particular, are looking pretty bleak. And it he's not going into this in a strong position. And as we had said, Trump's voters are mobilized. They're angry. They feel spurned from last election cycle, and that's something that is going to carry over. And like I said, I'm not going to go as far as to declare a definitive prediction for winner. I think anyone doing that in March is insane. I know that Nikki Haley finally conceded. Thank you. I'm glad that has happened. Has finally suspended her campaign. But the primaries are still technically not over. There's of course a Senate and the House that are both up in the air, as we get in most election cycles. In fact, all election cycles, the House is up in the air. But there's a lot of other pivotal positions here, and when it comes to just, I mean, not that Congress has been functional in, I don't even want to speculate how long that's been, but even if Biden does pull this off and he still has a hostile Congress to him, it could just be 4 more years of the worst gridlock we've ever seen. And actually, an interesting Trump ad I did see that brought up a very valid question is, will Biden survive 4 more years? And they use those exact words. They blatantly said, is this man capable of staying alive and coherent, or relatively coherent, until 2029? Because keep in mind, 2029 in January is, if Biden is reelected, that is when his term would end. And at that point, let's see, he's 82 right now, right? Am I wrong
I think
there?
he's 80 now,
Oh,
or
okay.
maybe
So he's
82.
a little, but we're talking anywhere from 85 to 86 by the time this man leaves office, and he is this bad at 80. And I mean, frankly, I know it's a long shot. I don't think it's going to happen. But just looking at this, once to borrow a phrase I've used 1,000 times in this episode already, just looking purely strategically, I don't see how the Democrats can't afford not to replace Biden.
Yeah, I mean, some people have speculated that even Newland's apparent dismissal has something to do with a falling out with Biden. That I, I, I mean, I can't put any credence to this, but would be like Harris would become. She wanted somebody other than Biden, and anyways, I don't want to give it too much credence. It sounds ridiculous, those. Uh, let's say Harris becomes president because he can't serve anymore, then that could be a way for Harris to choose one of the Obamas as a vice president. It's so outlandish, right? I don't know what to think of that, but some
I mean,
people have
if
said
we're
that.
talking about Democrats who actually want to win, and which I do think they do want to preserve their grasp on power, of course, there is only one Democrat with national name recognition that could pull off an election against Trump, and that's Gavin Newsom. And I don't know if he has even any interest in running this election cycle. I think he's in his 50s, so he's got plenty of time to run if he wants to. He's a young guy as far as politics is concerned, but insofar as it stands now, I think like I said, the only nationally recognized Democrat that can win is Gavin Newsom, and there's really no way around that. I know people speculate about Michelle Obama. That comes out of the I would say Q adjacent rumor mill, so take that for what it is. And those are the same people who also do speculate, not unrealistically, that Obama is still very influential in the current administration. In fact, actually pulling a lot of the strings. That Biden is a bit of a front man. So, which is funny because the people who denounce that are the same people who insist that Medvedev spent 4 years as just taking every marching order from Putin from 2008 to 2012, and that not the fact that, like, of course we all know that Putin is the much more ubiquitous figure, but not the fact that he might actually have some sort of agreement and understanding of the policies of the Russian state and the fact that they are genuine political allies, and he just must be a puppet taking marching orders. But that's I don't know, it's just something funny I'd noticed.
Uh, Go ahead. Go ahead.
But I mean, the idea that just going back to some of these, it's a bit of a side, but going back to these Q adjacent people, the fact that Obama is still very influential in the current administration, I don't think is far fetched at all. And but I do think Michelle Obama actually running is a bridge too far.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so the the analysis was from a Telegram account called the Oriental, discussing Nuland. The news of Victoria Nuland's departure came from the U.S. Secretary of State Blinken, which in itself is significant. Nuland is allegedly being forced to announce her resignation in this way. That's another sign, right? Nuland herself is silent, but the decision is indisputable. To prevent Nuland from changing her mind, Blinken officially announced the news. Most likely, Nuland will leave as ambassador to Israel, or representative to the UN. She will definitely work for Joe Biden's campaign on a voluntary basis as an integral part of the team of the current U.S. president. You don't get off the boat like that easy. But it is an obvious sign that a conflict is brewing in the camp of the deep state Democrats, and this conflict is over Ukraine. Nuland is a key supporter of the White House's unbending pro-Ukraine position at any cost, and the price now is the seat of the President of the United States. Nuland believes that for Biden to maintain the current course, he needed to leave the race and give way to Michelle Obama. She categorically opposed the new nomination of Biden-Harris tandem. So the Democratic Party HQ decided not to initiate the 25th Amendment and to let the current tandem go to the elections, so that after this, Biden would leave for health reasons and be replaced by Harris. Key sponsors of the Democratic Party are in favor of her candidacy and accordingly this election scenario. It is believed that Harris's vice president will be none other than the shadow president, Barack Obama himself. Maybe not that crazy, but anyways, I just
Like the idea itself is not crazy.
So apparently
but
there was a dispute.
Yeah, the idea itself is not crazy, but some of the other stuff attached to it is a bit outlandish. But I do think that's very good analysis. Whether I agree with every point or not, it's relevant. I do think that it does bring up quite a few good points, however. But I suppose when we've covered just about every major topic, unless you had any last minute things we had left out.
Yes. So one of the hilarious things that my brother is into lately is Jack Van Imp videos. Now, if you don't know who Jack Van Imp is or was, he's still going, I think. You can still find videos from like the 2000s, the 10s, like, but he's been around since the 80s. So I'm gonna send you this. Oh, this is so hilarious.
Oh boy, hold on. Let me get this.
So this is from 1989. You have to know that after the Soviet Union fell, he went in the 90s about aliens, and I'm not saying he did that every show, but I did catch my brother sent me the wrong link. It was the link to this video that I wanted, and a specific thing that he said. So on the show, he constantly talks about Russia, right? Russia is Gog Magog, and it's going to destroy Israel, and it wants to destroy Israel, and so on and so on, and all the well, why is it Gog Magog? Oh, Magog is Moshesh and Mish and Mash, and eventually you get to Muscovy and then Moscow. He mentions like 9 names that go from Magog to Moscow. It's so
schizophrenic.
So schizophrenic, right? And so on this episode, he's talking about Israel is even preparing. If you let me just edit this a little bit, because the text is
It's distracting. Okay, so I'm going to send it to you now. So he's talking about Gomer, and he had a son named Hayek who founded Syria, right? So he mentions Syria. And he also mentioned Egypt, of course, right? Before he got into the Syria part, right? He's giving all these biblical names, Ham and so on. And then he mentions China, right? There's China.
Oh, I love those borders with Mongolia included.
Yes, yes. So, um, so he mentioned, and you can read and something troubled him. This Antichrist who sits in the temple of Jerusalem. My brother and I started like laughing hysterically because, like, he's literally saying, Egypt, Syria, China, and Russia are going to join forces and attack the poor Antichrist sitting on his throne in Israel. Like, who are the bad guys? Like, what the hell are you even talking about? And one of my favorites is, so he says, but who's going to defend Israel, right? Now he mentions that it could be Saudi Arabia, right? But then he also mentions the merchants of Tarshish. And who's Tarshish? Well, it's Great Britain, don't you know? The United Kingdom. It's- so the mental gymnastics that Tarshish had all these boats. It's like, I'm pretty sure that Britain 2,500 to 3,000 years ago was literally a know nothing place. Yes, the Greeks talk about buying tin from there, but this, like, I mean, come on, right?
Even in the
And
Roman era, it was the hinterlands. It was like,
right, and you're also supposed to believe, right, like that. I mean, I understand providence. Okay, I get it, but you're supposed to believe that, like, Tarshish is the United Kingdom because they were merchants. It was one of the most hilarious things. But my favorite part by far was these forces are going to join together to attack the Antichrist in Israel. And I have to admit, so I did troll Lambda. Lambda is a guy in the academic age and sphere, and he had like a prophecy podcast that he did with two or three other people. He's a nice man. To me, he seems like a very serious and devout Christian. No, I don't doubt that. He's a Protestant. I don't know if, like, which denomination. But he was basically saying the same thing, and I was trolling him, and he said, "So I go, so who are these democratic forces?" And he says, "Oh, that's Britain." I go, "So Britain is going to defend Israel, and that's because they recognize Christ as the Messiah." He goes, "No, no." So, anyways, I just thought that was so hilarious.
that's, after the show is over, whether it's tomorrow, whether it's some point, I'm going to take some time and I'm going to go deep down this rabbit hole, and we're going to have a serious discussion about this, whether it's on an actual episode or whether it's on a special episode, because you've brought
Yes.
this to my attention, and this cannot go unanswered. But if that's all you had, I think that's a wonderful finale. I wouldn't end the show any other way.
Yes, that's it.
Okay, so thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode of the War Report. I promise you we will have a further discussion on this because I really want to go down this rabbit hole now. I know it's going to be next episode. I want to block out a special time slot where we make a special episode of the program in order to address this because there's so much to work with here.
I've asked my brother to join us, but He claims he's tired. He's just bashful. He doesn't want to do it. He may never do it, but I just think it would be so awesome if he did.
I mean, I certainly. And you know what? My goal is to get him on the show before you meet an untimely end, so the audience can meet the replacement.
It's so nice. See that,
Because
audience?
look, we all know GSP. We all love him, but he's on a crash course with fate. Okay, and I don't think any of us can deny that. This man lives a dangerous life. He's unhinged, and he has a lot of enemies. And I'd hate to see something happen and him without a solid replacement.
But if it did,
but if it you look, at first I was just gonna try to pass off his brother as him and hope none of you would notice. But then I met them in person. I realized this is never gonna work. That went straight out the window. I got my car searched trying to get there. Okay, that was my level of dedication. But I digress. So thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode of the War Report, and we'll see you guys next time. And goodbye.
thank you and take care, guys.